Lenora Osei had been cleaning the Hartwell Group's executive floor for 11 months before anyone on the 32nd floor learned her last name. That was by design. She arrived each morning at 6:15, before the senior partners showed up, with their flat whites and their tailored suits and their certainty that the world had been arranged for their benefit. She emptied the recycling bins. She wiped down the glass walls of the boardroom. She restocked the small kitchen with the sparkling water that Mr. Fletcher insisted be cold but not too cold. She did all of this quietly, efficiently, and without drawing attention to herself. The partners, when they passed her in the hallway, did not say good morning. A few of them nodded. One, a man named Bryce Calloway, had a habit of pointing at something without looking at her directly, as though the gesture alone were sufficient instruction. Once, early on, he had indicated a spill near the photocopier by tapping the floor with his foot, like he was directing a dog. Lenora had looked at the spill, looked at his foot, and gone to get the mop. She did not say anything. That was also by design. What Bryce Calloway did not know, what none of them knew, because none of them had thought to ask, was that Lenora Osei held a Master of Laws from Dalhousie University, a postgraduate certificate in corporate governance from the Rotman School of Management, and 7 years of experience as a junior compliance officer at a mid-sized firm in Halifax. She had passed the bar in both Nova Scotia and Ontario. Her mother had come to Canada from Kumasi with $40 and a suitcase. Lenora had come to Toronto with a degree, a plan, and a clarity about what she was willing to endure in order to get where she was going. The cleaning job was temporary. Everything was temporary if you were patient enough. The Hartwell Group occupied the top 4 floors of a glass tower on Bay Street. It was not the oldest firm in the city, but it had a reputation for behaving as though it were. The founding partners, 2 of whom had since retired and 1 of whom had died, had built the practice on M&A, work for mid-market companies across Ontario and Alberta. By the time Lenora arrived, the firm was in the middle of its most significant transaction in a decade, the acquisition of a Calgary-based energy company called Faro Peak Resources. The file was handled almost entirely by Bryce Calloway. Bryce was 44, a senior partner, the kind of man who said things like, "at the end of the day," and "let's circle back," without any apparent awareness that he was doing it. He had the easy confidence of someone who had never had a door closed in his face. Not because he was particularly brilliant, but because every door he'd ever approached had already been held open for him by someone else. His office was on the corner. His assistant, a woman named Nadia, kept his calendar with the precision of someone who had learned, through hard experience, that disorganization had consequences for her and not for him. He was also, Lenora had come to understand, not as good at his job as he believed himself to be. She knew this not because she had read his files. She had not, but because she listened. This was the other thing that no one on the 32nd floor understood about her, that the woman refilling the paper tray in the corner of the room was paying attention. Not prying, not scheming, simply present and awake in a way that most of them had stopped being years ago. She heard Bryce on his phone one afternoon, pacing the length of his office, while she wiped down the credenza near the door. He was talking to someone at Faro Peak. She could tell from context, and he was explaining, in the careful language of a man who was managing a problem rather than solving one, that the regulatory timeline was more flexible than initially anticipated. He used the phrase twice. The second time, his voice had a quality she recognized, the tone of someone reassuring themselves as much as the person on the other end. Lenora finished the credenza and moved on. She had grown up in Scarborough, the second of 4 children. Her father, Edward Osei, had worked in logistics for the city for 22 years. Her mother, Janet, had cleaned houses, not offices, houses, for most of Lenora's childhood, and had done it with a dignity so complete that it had taken Lenora until she was in her 30s to understand it fully. You don't stop being who you are because of what they think they see. Her mother had told her once, while folding sheets in the small laundry room of a house in North York that belonged to someone else. You just wait. The right moment always comes. The trick is knowing it when you do. Lenora had written that down in a notebook she kept. She still had it. The reason she was cleaning offices instead of practicing law was straightforward, though it was not a story she told easily. She had left her position in Halifax when her father had a stroke. She had come back to Toronto to help her mother navigate the care system, the hospitals, the insurance, the slow and exhausting machinery of a family crisis. By the time her father had stabilized enough that she could think about returning to work, her former firm had restructured and her position no longer existed. She had applied to 14 firms in Toronto. She had received 2 interviews and no offers. She had a theory about why, but she kept that theory to herself. The cleaning position had come through an agency. It was supposed to last 6 weeks. Then the agency had called to say the contract was being extended, and then extended again. Lenora had kept showing up, partly because she needed the income, and partly because somewhere around month 4, she had realized something that unsettled her, and then gradually clarified her thinking entirely. The Hartwell Group was in trouble. Not financial trouble, at least not yet. Regulatory trouble, structural trouble, the kind that accumulates quietly over years and then surfaces at the worst possible moment, usually during a major transaction. She had not gone looking for this information. It had come to her in fragments, the way knowledge always arrives when you are paying attention and other people have forgotten that you are in the room. The first fragment arrived on a Tuesday in March. She was cleaning the small boardroom adjacent to Bryce's office, the one the partners used for internal meetings, not client meetings, when she noticed a document left on the table. She had no reason to read it. She picked it up to move it and set it face down on the credenza. But she had seen, in the 2 seconds it took to lift and turn the page, 3 things: the Faro Peak letterhead, a circled figure in the middle of a paragraph, and the word non-compliant. She set the document face down and left the room. But the words stayed with her. Over the following weeks, she began to notice other things. The way the associates who worked on the Faro Peak file left the office later and later, with a specific exhaustion of people who were fixing something rather than building something. The way Bryce's voice on his calls had shifted from the expansive confidence of a man closing a deal to the careful, managed tone of a man managing a problem. The way Nadia, his assistant, had started keeping the door to his office closed in the afternoons, which she had never done before. Lenora was not a compliance officer anymore. She was a cleaner. She told herself this regularly. But she also knew what she knew. In April, she did something she had not planned to do. She went home after her shift, opened her laptop, and looked up the public filings for Faro Peak resources. She was not accessing anything she shouldn't. Everything she read was publicly available. She was simply applying to information that was already there, a set of skills that no one on the 32nd floor knew she had. What she found took her most of the night to work through. By the time she closed the laptop at 2 in the morning, she had a clear picture of something that Bryce Calloway, apparently, did not, that the Faro Peak acquisition, as currently structured, had a significant exposure under recent amendments to the Competition Act that his team had almost certainly not accounted for. The kind of exposure that, if it materialized during or after closing, could cost the client tens of millions and cost the firm its reputation on a file of this size. She sat for a long time in her kitchen. Then she closed the laptop and went to bed. She went back and forth on it for 3 weeks. The arguments against doing anything were obvious. She was the cleaning staff. She had no standing in this firm. She had no relationship with any of the partners. If she walked into someone's office and said what she knew, the best outcome was that they would thank her politely and never call her. The worst outcome, the more likely outcome, was that she would be asked to explain herself, then dismissed, and possibly reported to the agency for reading documents she wasn't supposed to have read even though she hadn't. She thought about her mother, about the house in North York, about the folded sheets. She thought about Bryce Calloway tapping the floor with his foot. She thought about her father, who was still in the rehab facility in Etobicoke, relearning how to walk, doing it with a stubbornness so characteristic that the nurses had started calling him the Admiral. She thought about patience, about the right moment, about knowing it when it comes. Then she did something that surprised even herself. She applied for a position, not at the Hartwell Group. There was no open position she could apply for there. And even if there were, she was fairly certain that being the person who cleaned their coffee mugs did not constitute a compelling origin story for a lateral hire. She applied for a compliance advisory position at a firm called Belcourt Partners, a smaller boutique on King Street that specialized in cross-border M&A and had a reputation for hiring people who did not fit the standard profile. She applied because the Belcourt name had appeared 3 times in the public documents she had read about Faro Peak. Belcourt was on the other side of the Faro Peak transaction. The interview was on a Thursday afternoon in late May. She had booked a personal day through the agency. She wore a charcoal suit she had bought 6 years ago in Halifax and had kept in dry cleaning bags ever since, waiting. She took the subway to King and walked the 4 blocks in flats, carrying her heels in her bag, changing on the sidewalk outside the building, because she had learned, long ago, that arriving in heels meant arriving ready to perform, and she didn't want to perform. She wanted to be seen clearly. The interview was conducted by a woman named Catherine Folds, one of Belcourt's senior advisors, and a man named James Okafor, the firm's head of compliance and regulatory affairs. They were both businesslike and specific in their questions, which Lenora appreciated. She had been in enough interviews to know that vague questions came from people who didn't know what they needed. These two knew. She answered their questions directly. She spoke about her work in Halifax. She spoke about the specific provisions of the Competition Act amendments, the ones Bryce Calloway's team had missed. Not by naming the Hartwell Group, but by framing them as a general concern that had emerged, in her view, across several recent transactions she had been following. James Okafor leaned forward slightly when she mentioned the amendments. "You've looked at the recent guidance from the commissioner?" he asked. "The January guidance, yes," Lenora said. "And the March letter. The thresholds on notifiable transactions were adjusted in a way that I don't think has fully filtered through to how some firms are structuring the filing timeline." James and Catherine exchanged a look. It was a brief look, professional, neutral. But Lenora had been paying attention for 11 months in a building full of people who thought she wasn't watching, and she knew the difference between a look that meant nothing and a look that meant something. She took the subway home and ate soup and waited. They called her the following Monday. She started at Belcourt on the 1st of July. She gave the agency 2 weeks' notice. The agency supervisor, a pleasant man named Bob, who had never asked what her educational background was, expressed mild surprise and then wished her well. Her last day at the Hartwell Group was a Thursday. She cleaned the 32nd floor for the last time, restocked the sparkling water, wiped down the boardroom table, and left without saying anything to anyone. Bryce Calloway was on a call when she passed his office. He did not look up. She thought, he has about 6 weeks. Her first 3 weeks at Belcourt were an adjustment, but a good one. The office was smaller, the hierarchy flatter. People introduced themselves by first name. No one pointed at spills with their foot. James Okafor had a directness she respected. He said what he meant, expected the same in return, and had a low tolerance for time wasting disguised as thoroughness. On her 3rd week, he put a file in front of her. "Faro Peak Resources," he said, "Calgary-based. We're representing the vendor on a proposed acquisition. Deal's supposed to close in September. I'd like you to take a look at the filing structure and tell me if you see anything." Lenora looked at the file. She looked at James. "I'll have something for you by Friday," she said. She had her notes on the Faro Peak public filings at home. She had kept them, not for any particular purpose. She had told herself at the time, just because she was someone who kept notes. Now, she understood why she had kept them. She stayed late on Tuesday and Wednesday. She worked with the precision and economy of someone who has been waiting for a specific problem to arrive and has been preparing for it without knowing she was preparing. By Friday morning, she had a 23-page memorandum outlining the regulatory exposure in the current deal structure, the specific provisions at issue, the likely outcome if the matter proceeded to a formal review, and 3 alternative approaches to restructuring the transaction timeline in a way that would address the risk. She printed it, set it on James's desk, and went to make coffee. He appeared in the doorway of her office 40 minutes later. He was holding the memo and had the look of a man recalibrating something. "How long have you been looking at this file?" he said. "Since March," she said. "The public materials." He looked at her for a moment. "Where were you working in March?" "I was between positions," Lenora said. Which was true. James nodded slowly. "This is good work," he said. "This is very good work. I'm going to need you in the room when we present this to the client." "Of course," she said. The client meeting was held in Belcourt's main boardroom on a Tuesday morning in late August. Faro Peak sent 3 people from Calgary. Their CEO, a man named Douglas Faro, the founder's son, late 50s, the kind of man who had inherited both the business and the unshakable confidence that came with it, their CFO, and their in-house general counsel. The Hartwell Group sent Bryce Calloway and 2 of his associates. Lenora had known he would be there. She had known it since the moment James told her about the meeting. She had had 2 weeks to decide how she felt about it, and she had arrived at a position that surprised her a little. She felt nothing much at all, or rather, she felt something small and quiet, like the sound a door makes when it finally, after a long time, opens. She arrived at the boardroom before the clients. She set up her materials. She poured water into the glasses on the table. She was standing at the window, looking out at King Street, when the door opened and the Hartwell Group came in. Bryce Calloway walked in first. He was talking to one of his associates. He moved to the far end of the table, pulled out a chair, set down his portfolio. He did not look at Lenora. Then he looked at Lenora. She watched his face perform a series of rapid recalibrations. The first, recognition. The second, confusion. The third, a kind of defensive blankness. The expression of a person deciding in real time how to manage something they hadn't expected. She nodded once. Courteous. Professional. A greeting between colleagues. He said nothing. James opened the meeting with a summary of the regulatory issue. He was precise and clear. He did not editorialize. He simply laid out the problem. The exposure under the amended provisions, the potential for a formal review, the cost and timeline implications, and then he said, "I'd like our compliance advisor, Ms. Osei, to walk through the analysis and the proposed path forward." Lenora stood. She had given presentations before. She had given them to boards, to regulators, to rooms of people who were looking for a reason not to listen to her. She had learned, over the years, to begin by giving them no such reason. She began with the facts. She moved to the analysis. She was specific, structured, and unhurried. She spoke about the January guidance and the March letter. She spoke about the 3 restructuring approaches and the relative merits of each. She spoke about the timeline and what would need to happen in the next 4 weeks for the deal to close on schedule, cleanly, without triggering a review. The room was quiet in the way that rooms become quiet when people are actually listening. Douglas Faro asked 2 questions. Both were good questions. Lenora answered them without qualification. At one point, midway through the presentation, she felt the particular quality of someone's attention shift in the room. She did not look away from Douglas Faro, but she knew, from the corner of her awareness, that Bryce Calloway was sitting very still. When she finished, James thanked her. The clients asked a few more questions, all addressed to Lenora. She answered them. Then the meeting moved to next steps, timelines, documentation. Bryce Calloway said almost nothing for the last 40 minutes of the meeting. His associates took notes. His face had the careful neutrality of a person in the middle of an experience they would only fully process later. After the clients left, James walked them to the elevator. Lenora stayed in the boardroom and began gathering her materials. She heard, behind her, the sound of someone remaining in the room. She turned. Bryce Calloway was standing near the door. His associates had gone ahead. It was just the two of them. He looked at her with an expression she had no easy category for. It was not quite remorse. It was not quite embarrassment. It was the expression of a person confronting something about themselves that they had managed, up until this moment, not to look at directly. "You were at Hartwell," he said. "You were." He stopped. He was trying to locate the right word or the right frame and not finding it. "I was the cleaning staff," Lenora said. She said it without any particular emphasis, just the fact of it. He was quiet for a moment. "The memo you presented today," he said. "The analysis. Did you?" "I developed it here at Belcourt," she said, "based on publicly available materials and my own research." He nodded. He was doing the arithmetic. She let him do it. "How long did you know?" he said. "About the exposure." Lenora considered him. Not the man who had pointed at spills with his foot. Not the partner in the corner office. Just a man who had missed something important and was beginning to understand the scope of what that meant. "Long enough," she said. She picked up her folder, excused herself with a politeness that was genuine. She had not come this far by being unkind, even to people who had earned unkindness, and walked out into the hallway. The Faro Peak deal closed in October, 3 weeks behind the original schedule, but within the revised timeline that Lenora's memo had outlined. The restructuring approach that Douglas Faro selected was the one she had flagged as the most conservative. Slower, but clean, with the lowest risk of triggering a secondary review. James told her afterward that Faro had specifically asked that she be copied on all future regulatory correspondence related to the file. 2 weeks after closing, Belcourt offered her a permanent position as a senior compliance advisor. She called her mother from the parking garage of the building because she needed a moment without glass walls around her. "I'm getting a promotion," she said. Her mother was quiet for a second. Then she laughed. Not a small laugh, a real one, the kind that carries 30 years of early mornings and other people's houses and folded sheets. "I know," her mother said. "You couldn't have known," Lenora said. "I've been waiting for this call for 2 years," her mother said. "I knew." Lenora stood in the parking garage for a while after they hung up. The cars around her were the expensive kind, the kind that came with the building. She thought about the subway. She thought about Dalhousie and Halifax and the rehab facility in Etobicoke, where her father was this morning almost certainly arguing with someone about the physiotherapy schedule. She thought about patience, about the right moment, about knowing it when it comes. She had known it. She had waited for it. And then, when the moment arrived, she had not needed to raise her voice, or confront anyone, or perform her credentials for a room full of people who had decided, before she opened her mouth, what she was. She had simply stood at the front of a boardroom on King Street and done her job. The rest had taken care of itself. The Hartwell Group's involvement in the Faro Peak file was eventually disclosed as part of the post-closing regulatory correspondence. The gap in the original filing analysis, the one Lenora had identified from publicly available materials in her kitchen at 2 in the morning, became part of an internal review that the firm was required to conduct. Bryce Calloway was not named publicly, but those inside the firm knew what had happened. And in a building where people spent considerable energy managing how they were perceived, that knowledge had its own weight. James Okafor told Lenora none of this directly. She learned about it the way she had learned most things in the past year. By paying attention to what was said around her, by the quality of the silences, by the specific way that certain conversations stopped when she entered a room. Not the old way, The way that meant she was invisible, but the way that meant she was someone whose presence mattered. Her father came home from the rehab facility in November. He walked in through the front door of her parents' house in Scarborough. Slowly, with a cane, and with the expression of a man who had no intention of discussing the difficulty of the past 10 months. He sat down in his chair. He asked Lenora how work was going. She told him. He listened the way he had always listened, carefully, without interruption, with the unhurried attention of someone who understood that some stories needed to be given their full length before you said anything about them. When she finished, he nodded once. "Good," he said, "just that." But the way he said it, the weight and the warmth of it, the particular quality of a father's pride that doesn't require amplification to carry across a room, told her everything that one small word was holding. She stayed for dinner. Her mother made jollof rice. Her youngest brother came by with his kids. The house was loud and warm and full of a kind of ease that Lenora realized she had been moving toward, without fully knowing it, for the past 2 years. The right moment always comes, her mother had said. The trick is knowing it when you do.